January 23, 1963, Moscow, Soviet Union. The Aeroflot jet touches down at Sheremetyevo Airport just after 3 p.m., its tires screeching against frozen concrete. Harold Adrian Russell Philby, Kim, to everyone who knows him, stares through the small oval window at a landscape bleached white by winter. He's 50 years old, though he looks older. The years of drinking have carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His hands shake slightly as he reaches for the armrest, steadying himself as the aircraft taxis toward the terminal. He's wearing a dark overcoat, rumpled from the journey, and his breath fogs the glass. Beyond the wing, he can see a small delegation waiting on the tarmac, men in long coats and fur hats. This is it. After 30 decades of lying, of living double, of betraying every friend and colleague who ever trusted him, he has finally come home to the country he claims to have served all along. Except it doesn't feel like home at all. The cabin door opens and cold air rushes in, sharp enough to sting. Philby rises from his seat, gathering his single leather briefcase. He's left almost everything behind in Beirut. His wife Eleanor doesn't even know he's gone. He had told her he was meeting a contact, kissed her goodbye at their apartment door, and walked straight to the harbor where a Soviet freighter was waiting. The crossing took weeks, hiding below deck, drinking to steady his nerves, wondering if British intelligence had figured out his plan. They probably had. By the time he boarded this flight from East Berlin to Moscow, MI6 would have known. They always knew more than they let on. That was the game. But they had let him run for years, even after suspicions hardened into certainty, because arresting him would have meant admitting how deeply they'd been penetrated. Now he descends the stairs into Soviet territory, and the men in coats step forward to greet him. They saw it shake his hand with formal warmth. They call him Comrade Philby. One of them, a stocky man with a broad Slavic face, speaks decent English and tells him that arrangements have been made for his accommodation. A car is waiting. Philby nods and smiles, playing the role of the grateful defector, the ideological hero finally rewarded for his sacrifice. But inside, a small voice whispers what he already knows. He has made a terrible mistake. The car is a black Volga, standard issue for KGB officers. It pulls away from the airport and heads into the city. Philby watches the buildings slide past. Moscow in January is a study in gray. Snow piled along the curbs has turned to slush, stained with exhaust and grime. The architecture is monumental, but cheerless. Broad avenues lined with apartment blocks that seem to stretch forever. People walk hunched against the cold, wrapped in layers of wool and fur. No one smiles. Philby lights a cigarette and tries to ignore the tightness in his chest. He tells himself this is temporary discomfort, the price of safety. He has escaped the hangman's noose. He will never face trial in Britain, never stand in the dock while prosecutors read out the names of agents he betrayed, operations he sabotaged, secrets he sold. He has won. But winning feels a lot like losing. They take him to an apartment on Pushkin Square, a spacious flat by Soviet standards, with high ceilings and decent furniture. There's a view of the square below, where Muscovites cross in diagonal lines toward the metro. A housekeeper has stocked the kitchen with bread, cheese, sausage, and several bottles of vodka. The stocky KGB officer tells Philby to rest, to settle in. Someone will come tomorrow to discuss his future. Then they leave him alone. Philby stands in the center of the living room, still wearing his coat. The silence is enormous. He walks to the window and looks down at the street. He thinks about Eleanor, who by now probably has found the note he left. He thinks about his children from previous marriages scattered across England, who will grow up knowing their father was a traitor. He thinks about Nicholas Elliott, his old friend from MI6 who had flown to Beirut just weeks ago to confront him. Elliott knew the truth, had laid it all out calmly over drinks, and offered Philby a way out. Confess, cooperate, and perhaps avoid prosecution. Philby pretended to consider it. He had even given Elliott a partial confession, enough to seem cooperative. Then he had fled. Elliott would never forgive him. None of them would. Philby pours himself a glass of vodka and drinks it, standing by the window. The burn helps. It always does. To understand how he arrived here, standing alone in a Moscow apartment with nowhere left to run, you have to go back 30 decades, back to Cambridge University in the early 1930s, when Kim Philby was a young man full of conviction and idealism, studying history and economics, watching Europe slide toward chaos. The Depression had shattered faith in capitalism. Fascism was rising in Germany and Italy. In Britain, millions were unemployed, queuing for bread while bankers and aristocrats dined in Mayfair. Philby, the son of a famous Arabist and explorer, had grown up privileged but restless. He wanted to matter. He wanted to change the world. At Cambridge, he fell into a circle of brilliant, disaffected students who believed the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope. Communism was not just an economic system to them. It was a moral crusade, a way to end exploitation and build a society based on equality and reason. Philby devoured Marx and Lenin. He attended meetings of the Cambridge Socialist Society. And in 1934, he was recruited by Soviet intelligence. The approach came through a talent spotter, another Cambridge student who identified Philby as someone with potential. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, was actively recruiting young intellectuals who could be shaped into long-term assets. They weren't looking for people to hand over documents immediately. They were looking for people who could burrow into the British establishment and rise through the ranks, becoming sources for years or even decades. Philby fit the profile perfectly. He was smart, charismatic, well-connected, and ideologically committed. He said yes without hesitation. His instructions were simple. Go underground. Stop attending socialist meetings. Distance yourself from radical politics. Build a respectable cover. Get a job in journalism or government. Wait. Philby obeyed. He left Cambridge and traveled to Vienna, where he reported on the civil unrest between Austrian fascists and socialists. He even married a young Austrian communist named Lizzie Friedman, partly out of affection and partly to help her escape the Nazi threat. Back in London, he reinvented himself as a conservative journalist. He wrote for The Times, covering the Spanish Civil War from the nationalist side, embedding himself with Franco's forces. It was perfect cover. No one suspected that the charming, well-spoken correspondent was secretly a Soviet agent. When World War II broke out, Philby joined the British intelligence service. He was recruited into Section V, which later became known as MI6, and assigned to counterintelligence operations against Germany and Italy. He was good at the work. He quickly proved himself capable, diligent, and trustworthy. His colleagues liked him. He had a slight stammer that made him seem self-effacing, and he drank heavily, which was common enough in intelligence circles that it didn't raise alarms. He was one of the boys. And all the while, he was feeding everything to Moscow. Every operation he learned about, every agent network, every decryption breakthrough, every strategic plan, it all went to his Soviet handlers. He met them in safe houses, in parks, in quiet pubs. He handed over documents photographed in his office after hours. He memorized details and recited them during clandestine meetings. The information he provided was invaluable. It allowed the Soviets to protect their own networks, to anticipate British moves, to neutralize threats. And because Philby was so trusted, so embedded, no one suspected him, not even when things started to go wrong. After the war, Philby's star continued to rise. He was posted to Istanbul as the MI6 station chief, then to Washington, D.C. as the liaison between British and American intelligence. It was one of the most sensitive positions in the Western intelligence apparatus. Philby sat in meetings where CIA and MI6 officers discussed joint operations against the Soviet Union. He learned about agents being infiltrated into Eastern Europe, about defectors being debriefed, about signals intelligence breakthroughs, and he passed it all to the KGB. Dozens of operations collapsed. Agents were arrested, networks were rolled up. The CIA and MI6 blamed bad luck, poor tradecraft, or Soviet vigilance. They didn't blame Kim Philby. He was too smooth, too convincing. When suspicion finally began to gather around him in the early 1950s, after the defections of two other Soviet agents, Guy Burgess and Donald McLean, who had also been part of the Cambridge Circle, Philby managed to deflect it. He was questioned, he was investigated, but he stayed calm, denied everything, and pointed to his record of service. In 1955, he was publicly cleared by the British government. The Foreign Secretary stood in Parliament and declared that there was no evidence Philby had betrayed his country. It was a lie, of course. MI6 suspected him. They just couldn't prove it. So they eased him out quietly, letting him resign without charges. Philby spent a few years in the cold, working as a journalist in Beirut, drinking too much, waiting to see if the axe would fall. It finally did in 1963, when new evidence surfaced. A Soviet defector provided details that pointed directly at Philby. MI6 sent Nicholas Elliott to confront him, and Philby, knowing the game was up, ran. Now, in Moscow, the hero's welcome he might have expected never materializes. The KGB gives him a pension, an apartment, and a new identity, but they don't trust him. How can they? He's a man who betrayed his own country for 30 years. Who's to say he won't betray them too? They keep him under surveillance. They limit his contact with other foreigners. They give him work translating documents and writing propaganda, but it's make work, meaningless. He's a trophy, a symbol of Soviet superiority, but he's not really needed. The isolation weighs heavy on him. He misses England. He misses the pubs, the conversation, the casual humor. He misses being someone who mattered. In Moscow, he's just another pensioner shuffling through the snow, buying groceries at state shops, drinking alone. He remarries eventually to a Russian woman named Rufina, who is kind but doesn't understand him. He tries to learn Russian but never masters it. He attends receptions where Soviet officials parade him in front of foreign journalists as proof that the West is corrupt and the revolution is just.
He smiles and says the right things, but the words taste like ash. The years pass slowly. Brezhnev's Soviet Union is not the workers' paradise Philby once imagined. It's a sclerotic bureaucracy ruled by a gerontocracy more interested in maintaining power than building socialism. The economy stagnates. The shops are half empty. The idealism that drove Philby as a young man has curdled into cynicism. He drinks more, he chain smokes, he spends long afternoons staring out the window, watching the seasons change, wondering if it was all worth it. Sometimes Western journalists are allowed to visit him. They come with notebooks and cameras, eager to interview the legendary traitor. Philby plays the role they expect, the unrepentant ideologue, still committed to the cause, no regrets. But occasionally, when the vodka has loosened his tongue, something else slips through. A wistfulness, a bitterness, a hint that he knows he made a catastrophic mistake. One journalist, years later, will report that Philby admitted he sometimes wished he could go back. Not to betray the Soviets, but to live a normal life in England, to walk through a London park without looking over his shoulder, to die in the country of his birth. But it's too late for that. He burned that bridge when he boarded the freighter in Beirut. There's no going back. By the 1970s, Philby is a relic. The Cold War has settled into a grim equilibrium. The KGB still parades him occasionally, but the novelty is worn off. His health deteriorates. The drinking has ravaged his liver. He has heart problems. He shuffles through his apartment in a bathrobe, unshaven, reeking of tobacco and alcohol. Rufina does her best to care for him, but he's a difficult patient, stubborn and self-pitying. He thinks about the people he betrayed, the agents who were arrested and executed because of information he provided, the colleagues who trusted him, who invited him to dinner, who confided in him, who never imagined he would sell them out. Nicholas Elliott, who had been his friend, Dick White, who had believed in him, James Jesus Angleton, the CIA counterintelligence chief who had shared secrets with him over long lunches in Washington. All of them betrayed, all of them made to look like fools. And for what? So he could spend his final years in a cramped Moscow apartment, ignored by the people he served, despised by the people he left behind, a ghost haunting the margins of history? There's a moment late in his life when a British journalist named Philip Knightley visits him. Knightley has known Philby for years, has written about him with a mix of admiration and critique. They sit together in Philby's apartment, drinking vodka, talking about the old days. Knightley asks him if he has any regrets. Philby hesitates. Then he says something that stays with Knightley for years. "I don't regret my choices, but I do regret the cost." It's as close to an admission as he'll ever make. Philby dies on May 11th, 1988, at the age of 76. The Soviet Union gives him a state funeral. He's buried with full honors, his coffin draped with the Soviet flag. KGB officers stand at attention as his body is lowered into the ground. The newspapers call him a hero of the Soviet people, a man who sacrificed everything for the cause. Western newspapers call him a traitor, one of the most damaging spies in history. Both are right, in their way. But the truth is more complicated. Philby was a man who believed so completely in an idea that he was willing to destroy his own life to serve it. He thought he was on the right side of history, fighting for a better world. And maybe in the beginning he was sincere. But ideology can be a prison as confining as any cell. It can blind you to the human cost of your actions, to the pain you inflict, to the possibility that you might be wrong. By the time Philby realized what he had done, it was too late. He was trapped in Moscow, surrounded by people he didn't trust, serving a system he no longer believed in, waiting to die. He had won the game, but the prize was a life of isolation and regret. And in the end, that's the real tragedy of Kim Philby. Not that he betrayed his country, though he did. Not that he destroyed lives, though he did. But that he betrayed himself. He traded everything, his home, his family, his friends, his future, for an idea that turned out to be hollow. And when he finally understood that, when he stood in that Moscow apartment on that frozen January day in 1963 and looked out at a city that would never feel like home, it was too late to do anything but pour another drink and wait for the end. The story of Kim Philby is a warning. It's a reminder that conviction without doubt is dangerous, that loyalty without question can lead to ruin, and that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones most capable of betrayal. It's also a reminder that every choice has a cost, and some costs are too high to pay. Philby spent his final years writing his memoirs, a self-serving account of his espionage career that portrayed him as a dedicated communist who never wavered. But those who knew him in Moscow tell a different story. They describe a man who drank himself to sleep most nights, who raged at the television when British programs were shown, who kept a map of England on his wall and stared at it for hours. They describe a man who, despite everything he said in public, deeply regretted the choices that brought him there. In the end, the man who betrayed everyone else betrayed himself most of all. He built his life on lies, and when the lies collapsed, there was nothing left. Just an old man in a foreign city, drinking vodka in a silent apartment, waiting for death and wondering if any of it had been worth it. The answer, of course, was no. But by then, it was far too late to matter.